The session between two men who were building something, Los Angeles, California, February 1969. A Tuesday afternoon around 3 p.m. The San Fernando Valley in February is its own particular thing. Not winter in any form that the word commonly implies, but a season of low, clean light that arrives at oblique angles and makes ordinary objects look considered, as if someone arranged them. The garage behind the house on Roscommare Road in Bel Air was a converted space. Ceiling cleared, floor padded with interlocking mats, a heavy bag in one corner that had been worked for years by hands that knew what they were doing. The walls held no mirrors. This was a choice. The man who trained here had decided, early in his relationship with himself, that mirrors in a training space create the wrong relationship between the practitioner and his own image. Bruce Lee had been in Los Angeles for most of a year, working on the television project that would become Longstreet, and training with the intensity that people who knew him then described consistently as something that exceeded normal frameworks for dedication. He was 28 years old and was in the process of developing Jeet Kune Do, not as a formal system with ranks and curricula and lineage certificates, because those were precisely the things he was trying to escape, but as a philosophy of motion, a living investigation into what the human body could become if you stripped away every assumption and started from the question of what actually worked. He had been influenced by boxing, Muhammad Ali specifically, the footwork, the economy, and by fencing and by Wing Chun and by the wrestling groundwork that he'd been exploring with anyone willing to engage it. He read obsessively. He took notes constantly in a handwriting that was, depending on the passage, either meticulous or illegible, as though the speed of thought had outrun the hand. He and Chuck Norris had met the previous year through the competition circuit, two men at the edge of American martial arts in the late 1960s, which was a small enough world that meaningful encounters were inevitable. What was not inevitable was what the encounter became. Friendships between competitive men in the same field have a natural resistance to depth, the proximity of comparison, the awareness of what the other represents by contrast. But Norris and Lee had found, in that first year, something more durable than admiration and more interesting than rivalry. They had found a shared question. The question, neither of them would have stated it this way, was approximately, what is this actually for? Not martial arts as category, not training as activity. But the specific thing, the years of repetition, the physical cost, the daily submission to difficulty, what at its foundation was the purpose? Not the tournament record, not the reputation, not the film work that was beginning to consume increasing portions of Lee's time. The thing underneath all that, the thing that persisted when the external validations were stripped away. This question was not rhetorical for either of them. It came from specific biographical reality. Norris had grown up in a household where his father's relationship with his own strength had been catastrophic. A man who could not be at peace with himself and who communicated the failure loudly, through absence, and through the specific damage that alcoholism does to the people who cannot leave. Norris had not become a martial artist as a response to his father, exactly. But the practice had given him, incrementally, the thing that his father had never found, a way to inhabit his own body without the body being a source of confusion and harm. Lee was negotiating his own version of this, born between cultures, never fully belonging to either, finding in the logic of motion a language that didn't require a passport. They had been sparring together irregularly for several months. This Tuesday was different from the others. Norris arrived at 3:08 with the quietness he always brought to unfamiliar or semi-formal situations, a quietness that people sometimes misread as shyness, and that was actually something more like consideration. He was aware of entering a space that belonged to someone else. He acknowledged the asymmetry without making a performance of it. He changed in the corner the way he always did, without preamble. Lee was already on the mat when Norris emerged from the corner, moving through a sequence of his own invention that drew simultaneously from Wing Chun's central line theory, the long-range entry techniques of Northern Chinese Kung Fu, and something that belonged to neither tradition. Something Lee was developing in real time, working through a problem with his body the way a mathematician works through a proof, testing the theorem from multiple angles, searching for the flaw. They warmed up separately for several minutes. Then together, moving through the kind of cooperative extension exercises that Lee had developed from watching physical therapists and gymnastics coaches, and that looked nothing like traditional martial arts warm-ups. Norris followed without comment. He had learned over the previous months that Lee's training concepts arrived pre-justified by their results, and that the time spent questioning the methodology was time better spent experiencing the methodology. The sparring began without formal announcement. This was Lee's way. He didn't signal the transition between preparation and practice because the distinction between them was, in his understanding, artificial. One thing became the other, the way conversation becomes argument, gradually, then suddenly. For the first 20 minutes, they worked at medium intensity, controlled, exploratory, each man testing the other's current state, not in the adversarial sense of looking for weakness, but in the collaborative sense of establishing what the conversation's vocabulary would be that day. Lee's style at this point in its evolution was characterized by an almost disturbing economy. He moved as little as he needed to, committed to nothing that wasn't already working, and when he committed, the commitment was total. He was not large, 5'7", perhaps 135 pounds at this period, and against Norris, who was bigger and stronger and who had technical competence in a broader range of positions, the size differential was meaningful. Lee did not fight the differential. He used it. He let it determine the tactics the same way a river lets the landscape determine its path. Not as submission, but as intelligence. Norris, for his part, brought to those 20 minutes what a decade of Tang Soo Do had built into his body. Distance management that was instinctive rather than calculated, a sense of interval, the gap between bodies, the moment when distance transitions from safety to danger and back, that most fighters consciously manage and that he experienced as a kind of spatial intuition. He had also brought, though he would not have framed it this way, a decade of competitive caution, the trained restraint of someone who has fought enough matches to know that aggression without structure is a loan that charges interest. At some point, the intensity changed. Lee threw a combination, straight lead, sidekick, back to straight lead, that was faster than the exchange they'd been having. Not dramatically so, but perceptibly, a gear shift rather than a floor press. Norris responded with the adjustment that his body knew, and for the next few exchanges, the tempo held at the higher level and the quality of the room changed. The mat sounds changed. The breathing changed. The way both men were looking at each other, which had been the look of two artists in a working conversation, shifted into something more present, more total, the look that comes when the body's processing load has increased past the level where the mind can supervise. In this state, over the following 30 minutes, something happened that was essentially impossible to observe from the outside because it had no visible event. No single exchange resolved it. No moment crystallized it. It accumulated the way understanding accumulates, through repetition, through the same problem encountered at different angles, through the growing recognition of a pattern. What Norris was finding in those 30 minutes was the limit of distance. He had built his fighting on interval, the management of the space between bodies, and he was discovering, against Lee, that this management required a counterpart to be meaningful, that against someone who had internalized the concept of interception, who attacked not the body but the commitment, who found the moment between intention and completion and lived in it. Distance management was a language being spoken to someone who didn't use it. He was not being beaten. He was being asked a question that his current vocabulary couldn't answer. What Lee was finding was different. He was finding, in Norris's physical structure, the way the bigger man generated power from sequence, from the kinetic chain, from foot to hip to shoulder to hand, something that his own smaller-bodied system had solved differently, but that contained a principle he hadn't fully accounted for. He had, in the development of Jeet Kune Do, been moving toward minimal structure, toward the elimination of form in favor of function. What he found in sparring with Norris was that structure, correctly understood, was not the opposite of function. It was another word for it. Form wasn't decoration. It was the record of what had worked, passed down through bodies across centuries. He stopped mid-exchange, not from injury or fatigue. He simply stopped, held up a hand, and stepped back. Norris stopped with him. They were both breathing hard, not the desperate breathing of exhaustion, but the deep, rhythmic breathing of people who have been working seriously for a sustained period. Lee sat down on the mat, cross-legged, back straight, looking at nothing in particular. After a moment, Norris sat down across from him. The garage was quiet, except for the breathing and the distant sound of the neighborhood, a lawnmower somewhere, a car on the hill road above. The light through the small window near the ceiling had shifted, as it always does in the afternoon, toward yellow. Lee said, "When you stop me at distance, what are you thinking?" Norris considered this. "Nothing," he said. "Not thinking. Feeling the interval." Lee nodded slowly. "If I take the interval away, then I have to find a different answer." "Which is what?" Norris was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet." This was the answer that mattered, not as a confession of weakness. They both knew what Norris could do from close range, had experienced it in previous sessions, but as an honest acknowledgement that the question Lee's fighting was asking was genuinely new, and that it was going to require a genuinely new answer. The Tang Soo Do tradition gave him tools. The tools were real. But the tradition had been built in response to certain assumptions about how bodies interact, and Lee had refused those assumptions. Lee pulled a notebook from the corner. It was always near the mat, always accessible, and wrote something in his half-legible hand. He showed it to Norris, who read it without speaking. What Lee had written was a question, not a statement. It concerned the relationship between style and self, whether a practitioner's system should be an expression of who they are or a container that shapes who they become. It was the question that Jeet Kune Do was, at its core, attempting to answer in practice rather than in theory. Norris handed the notebook back. "Both," he said. At the same time, Lee looked at him. How? The system gives you the question. You give it the answer. He paused. And that's why Kim kept saying the same form was always different. Lee wrote this down. They sat with it for a while. The light continued its slow shift toward evening. At some point, one of them got up, and they resumed working. Lighter now, more experimental, less structured. 2 men in a garage using their bodies to think out loud. They trained together for another 2 hours. What each of them took away from that Tuesday afternoon lived, subsequently, not in statements or notebooks or interviews, but in practice, in the choices that accumulated over the following years into legacies that neither of them had designed and both of them, in different ways, had been working toward since the first time someone showed them that the body, disciplined, becomes a mind. Lee was dead in 4 years. Norris was alive, still training, still teaching, still carrying the question in his body the way it had been given to him. In motion, not in language, by a man who trained in a garage with no mirrors because he had decided to know himself without reflection. The garage on Roscommare Road still exists. It has been other things since. It holds no memory of what happened in it, the way all spaces hold no memory. The memory lives, if it lives at all, in the people who were there, and when they are gone, in what they left behind them in other people, in rooms, in bodies that don't know the origin of what they know. Los Angeles, California, 1968, 1973, the years of the friendship.